So today we are going to cover the topic of ADHD. I chose ADHD for two reasons. The first reason is due to my brother. Growing up, he was a kid who had ADHD, but none of the teachers really understood him. While he was acting out and being a distraction in the classroom, they chose to, instead of trying to figure out what would best make him successful in the classroom, they would rather just send him to the principal's office. So due to that and just seeing all the trouble, and even now the ways he's still struggling with this issue, is a reason why ADHD has always been a passion of mine. The other reason is because it's the disability that I see most often in my kids. I teach resource and inclusion, and so I see it in the general ed population as well as in the special education population. So the question we are going to be covering today is, what assistive technology devices will help students with ADHD stay on task? Alright, so before we start talking about the assistive technology devices that help students be successful in the classroom, we first need to identify what ADHD is. So ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. This is a neurological disorder, and so as you see in this picture, students with ADHD, their brain looks different. So on average, their brain is delayed by about 3 years. And where you can see this difference the most is in the prefrontal cortex. And so this is at the top of the brain. And so here we have green, where it's typically developed. Here it's more red. And so in the prefrontal cortex, you have your ability to attend to lessons, think, and plan. You also have your ability to regulate emotions and make good judgments for behavior. And so kids with ADHD, especially in middle school, they don't know how to handle you getting onto them. And so instead of just thinking it out and staying calm, they immediately respond with a lot of emotions. Alright, so assistive technology. Assistive technology can cover a vast range of tools that help students in the classroom. They range from low tech all the way to high tech. This picture depicts how teachers, developers, and children with ADHD all work together with the common goal of using and creating assistive technology to help the students become more independent and successful. Today, the technology we are going to cover is line reading tools, flexible seating, chimes with checklist, classroom fidgets, and iPads with applications. Alright, so the first assistive technology we're going to talk about is line reading tools. Line reading tools are a great low-tech assistive technology device that helps students stay focused on where they are reading on a page. These devices can range from a highlighted strip to simply using a ruler to underline each line as one reads. I found a unique study that analyzed the relationship between students with ADHD and reading disabilities. It specifically studied eye tracking movement from both populations compared to that of a typical student. In this study, it was found that medicated and unmedicated children with ADHD made more eye tracking errors than the control group, which was made up of typical students in the same age range. This was an interesting study because it helped distinguish the difference between students with ADHD and reading disabilities. Students with ADHD have a difficulty reading due to executive functioning problems. However, students with reading disabilities such as dyslexia have deficits in phonological processing and being able to decode words. These findings indicate that students with ADHD were not able to fix their attention on the reading as long as students without ADHD. They had a harder time staying on task and getting through the whole passage compared to students without ADHD. This is important to note and shows the importance of why kids with ADHD need the line reading tools. Even a simple using a pencil can help, but it's best for using some type of ruler or paper that can slide down with the students as they read. Alright, so next we are going to talk about flexible seating. Flexible seating is my personal favorite that we are going to talk about today. Flexible seating allows students to move while attending to the lesson. Most of my students are able to focus and concentrate for a longer time because they are able to move. Flexible seating is also a great way to give students control of their learning by being able to pick where they want to sit for the day. My students know that they can move and choose the seat they want, and it can change daily as long as they have chosen a seat that helps them to learn, focus, and it doesn't distract them from their peers. My students honestly have done a great job of this, and if a student beside them starts distracting them, or they realize somewhere in the middle of my lesson that this flexible seating isn't helping with their learning, they decide that it's time to move and try another flexible seating. And so this helps with responsibility as well. They take ownership of their learning, and this helps for when they get into older grades and even into college, they know how to figure out what works best for them. So some of the flexible seating I have in my classroom are the wobble stool. And so this is a personal favorite. They're able to rock back and forth, side to side. My students know that they're not supposed to make circles with them, but as long as they're just slightly moving, then that's okay. The same goes for the medicine balls. They can sit on it, rock, bounce a little bit, and this helps for one of my students who has severe ADHD. He's constantly moving if he's in a regular seat, and so this works great for him. He sits in the back and he's able to move as much as he needs to for that day. Alright, so the next assistive technology we're going to talk about is using chimes with a checklist. And so what I typically see teachers doing is they're in a study hall, they're watching their kids work, and then the teacher starts doing another task. They look up, and they realize a student is off task, so they call them out in front of everyone. So this study has a different approach, and so this takes place in a study hall, and it watches 3 10th grade students. So these 3 10th grade students do have the diagnosis of ADHD. And so the way this happens is that 3 different forms of data were collected. We had the baseline data, and that's where an observer came in and recorded data pertaining to on-task behavior demonstrated by those 3 students. And so what he did was he would watch each student for 10 seconds, and if they were on task, he would circle a yes or a no. After that 10 seconds, he would move on to another student and circle yes or no to see if they are on task. He did this for 20 minutes. The next data that was collected was the student self-monitoring. And so the student had on headphones, and every 2 minutes the headphones had a chime. And when that student when the student heard the chime, they circled a yes or no to say if they were on task or not when that chime went off. And so if a student was working on an assignment, then they would circle yes. If they were caught daydreaming, they would circle no. And so they did this for a full 20 minutes. And so to see if that aligned with, or to see if the student was even telling the truth, the observer would watch one of the 3 students. And so he would watch this student for that 20 minutes, and if the data matched up, then they were good to go. And so the other piece of data that was collected was self-monitoring with a reward. And so kind of similar to the self-monitoring before, the student recorded themselves for 20 minutes to see if they are on task or not. And the reward came in as if their data matched up exactly to the person watching them, then they received a piece of candy. And so they could only be off by 1. And so if they lied at all, even twice, then they didn't get the reward. And so this helped all the students, and it helped them in different ways. And so the first student that we're going to cover is John. So his baseline had a mean of 51%. So that means that he was on task for 51% of the time. For the self-monitoring, he was on task for 92% of the time. And then when you added the reinforcement, he was on task for 93% of the time. Our next student that we're going to talk about is Paul. So Paul's baseline data was 46%. For the self-monitoring, his data was 75%, And the last one with the reinforcement was 97%. And so if you offered that piece of candy, he was on task 97% of the time. The last student we're going to cover is Linda. Linda's baseline data was 47%. Her self-monitoring data showed 64% on task, and self-monitoring with reinforcement was 96% of the time. And so by incorporating the chimes, the checklist, and reinforcement to the students, they are on task over 95% of the time. And so using this skill, it helps students to take charge of their learning by knowing if they're on task or off task. And this is a skill that they can use later on in life. Okay, so another assistive technology we're going to talk about is using classroom fidgets. And so in my inclusion classroom, they don't have the opportunity to have the flexible seating like I have in my resource room. And so they're allowed to use the fidgets. And so fidgets help students who have sensory related issues. And so students who constantly need to be touching something to get that extra stimuli that they need. Undersensitivity is very common among ADHD, which calls for needing sensory stimuli to focus more effectively. And so if they're not getting that sensory input, then they are more focused on what they need versus paying attention to the lesson. And so these are a couple fidgets that students can use: the Tangle, the Cube, fidget band. And so when looking at fidget tools, they can become a distraction easily if they're not handled properly. And so two things I use to keep in mind is to determine if it's a toy versus a fidget is, does it require a lot of concentration? And so if a kid has to be looking down at it to try to figure out how it works, such as a Rubik's Cube, then they're not focusing on me and my lesson. They're focusing on the toy, the Rubik's Cube. But if the student is able to have it in one hand and just messing with it and receiving their stimuli, but still focusing on my lesson, then it's a great fidget for that student, and it helps them to be more successful because they're able to receive that stimuli that they need, which then allows them to focus on the lesson. Okay, so our last assistive technology that we're going to talk about is using the iPad with applications. And so an iPad is something that a lot of my kids already have, and so it's something that they want to be on. So using this as a tool to help them be more successful, students are more receptive to using it versus trying to use another strategy. And they also feel cool that they're using an iPad. And so the iPad, there are 3 different apps that I really have enjoyed. And the first one is Procedural Pal. The other one is Task Tracker. And then the last one is the Training, Attention, and Learning Initiative program. And so these 3 programs have a couple aspects in common. And so one is having a checklist for students. And so these tasks, you can have a goal, and then from your goal that you have identified, you can break that goal up into several different tasks. And once students have completed that task, they can just check it off. And so I'm a person who loves to check things off, and my students also like to check things off too, because it helps them feel like they're finishing assignments and getting a good jump start. So these apps also send reminders to students if they haven't completed a task in a certain amount of time, or messages saying, okay, it's time to get back to an assignment if they have taken a break. So rather than focusing on remembering to complete the task alone, it will send them reminders. Alright, so to summarize my presentation, the question we looked at today is what assistive technology devices can help students with ADHD to stay on task. And so those assistive technologies we covered were using line reading tools, flexible seating, chimes with checklist, classroom fidgets, and iPad with applications. And so I hope you're able to use some of these tools in your classroom to help students with ADHD stay on task. Thank you.